And good evening again, everybody. I hope you can all hear me okay. So, as mentioned, what we're going to be looking at this evening is chapter 3 of Pope Francis's encyclical, Fratelli Tutti. And I probably spoke a little bit longer last week than I should have. I'll keep tonight's session just a little bit shorter to allow for some more question and answer time, and just to ensure that as many people can either ask a question or offer an insight as possible. And just at the very end of my presentation this evening, I'm going to then show you a very short video. I know I sent you on the TED Talk via Sylvia by Rabbi Sachs, and hopefully some of you got a chance to look at that. If you didn't, don't worry at all. We're not really sort of focusing on that tonight, but it's something you can return to in due course whenever you get a moment. I just thought it might be helpful for people to have a listen to Rabbi Sachs. Obviously, that TED Talk was given much before Fratelli Tutti was written, and he's obviously coming from a very different tradition in some respects. And he was commenting more just on the societal, political, economic scenario of the time, kind of the post-Trump election and so on. But the reason I use the TED Talk and the reason I like it for these kinds of groups is, in its own way, it kind of pulled together a lot of the threads that we find here in Fratelli Tutti. In 12 minutes, it helps to kind of bring together a lot of the different aspects and challenges and so on that Francis is actually looking at here in this encyclical. So it's just an interesting thing to listen to for that reason. And it's also, or at least in my opinion, it's also a very inspirational and hope-filled TED Talk. So I was going to get you guys to listen to it a bit later in the sessions, but after our last week's session together, I just thought it might be the appropriate moment maybe for you guys to have a listen to that. So at the end of my presentation, as I said, we're going to just look very briefly at a short video. It's only 2 minutes, 32 seconds, so it's not going to take very long. But in its own way, it kind of pulls together really what Francis is, or part of what Francis is getting at in this third chapter. So it might be just a nice way to end my presentation. So fingers crossed that I can master all of this technology, because I am a bit of a technophobe. If there are any difficulties, I'll just send this on to you again via Sylvia in the morning, but we should be able to see it in due course. So let's have a quick run through this third chapter. And what I'm going to offer to you this evening are just some of the key points as I have identified them in this chapter, the things that I found most striking, and so on. But everyone will take something different perhaps from it, and we all have our different take on things. So this is just my offering to you, and then in the Q&A afterwards we can have a more fuller conversation about this. So as we saw last week, the first chapter of Fratelli Tutti was entitled Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. And one of the things we need to remain, I suppose, cognizant of as we read all of Francis's documents, whether they're encyclicals or pastoral letters or anything else, is the kind of language he's using, because it is deliberate. Dark Clouds Over a Closed World, that first chapter outlines some of the challenges and the difficulties that we are currently facing, the signs of the times, if you like. And we identified some of that last week. The second chapter, where he unpacks this parable of the Good Samaritan, is kind of, it helps to launch us into the document. It's a technique to get us, I suppose, thinking about the moral demands that are placed on us, both as individuals and as a society. And in many respects, this is how we need to kind of read this third chapter. The chapter is entitled, or he uses the language of an open world. Okay, so if we look at the actual title of this document, where am I? Chapter 3, Envisaging and Engendering an Open World. So we're moving towards more positive and more hopeful language for a kickoff. But this third chapter is where Francis starts to outline his vision. Okay, he set up the dynamic, or he set up the problem in those earlier chapters. From here on in, he's like trying to say to us, this is the vision that I have for our world. And these are the kinds of attitudes and approaches that we need to be thinking about and adopting. So with that in mind, he says early on in this third chapter, he says we have to move beyond ourselves. So there's a very early section entitled Moving Beyond Ourselves. And he says in paragraph 89, our relationships, if healthy and authentic, open us to others who expand and enrich us. So we can find ourselves in a whole host of different types of relationships, obviously enough. Not every relationship is the same. And some of our relationships might in fact be quite destructive. So we have to be able to identify those relationships that are healthy and authentic, he says, and that open us to others and expand and enrich our horizons. And we all know, I'm sure, from our own experiences, that those relationships, be they friendships or intimate relationships or whatever it is we find ourselves in, that are life enhancing, are the ones that actually take us out of ourselves. And this is one of the points that Rabbi Sachs makes in that TED talk. Now, when we think of ourselves and of our relationships, there's two kind of levels, if you like, that we can identify. We understand ourselves as individuals. Okay, we're unique. The Trinitarian sort of anthropology and model of the person tells us that we are wonderfully unique, but also that we are in relationship. We're social animals, and we're made for relationship. We're made for mutuality, for reciprocity, all of these kinds of Trinitarian ideas. So we can understand ourselves as individual, and we can understand ourselves as social. And in this third chapter, as you read through it, you'll see some of the ways in which Francis brings out those two aspects of who we are. So on the individual level, for example, in paragraph 90 and in paragraph 91, he talks about, among other things, the sacred duty of hospitality. And this is a really rich and vibrant idea. It belongs to the Judeo-Christian tradition, of which we are a part, but it's also found beyond that tradition. For example, this ethic of hospitality is very strong within Islam. Okay, so it's this very ancient idea, rooted in many of these ancient religions, and that in Francis's language, it's a sacred duty. So this comes out in the parable of the Good Samaritan in chapter 2. This duty of hospitality, this ethic of generosity that comes out in the parable. And I suppose part of the question that's being asked of us here is, how do we as individuals better live out this sacred duty in our lives? So whether it's our attitude towards migrants, for example, coming into Ireland, whether it's towards the traveller community in our locality, whether it's towards women who have been trafficked into Ireland for the sex industry, whether it's towards our neighbours and our work colleagues, how do we as individuals extend this ethic or this duty of hospitality to others around us, whoever the other is? And Francis is saying in this section that we have to move beyond ourselves into a world that is bigger and that is relational. And he brings in parts of this section what we, in theological terms and in moral theology, would describe as virtue ethics. And we start looking at virtue and at moral character and at the kind of persons we are becoming, or the kind of persons that we're failing to become. You know, how do we work better at being better persons? And in paragraph 91, which you can read in your own time, he talks about the virtues, and he says they're only virtues to the extent that they foster openness and union with others. Sometimes we can think of something as a virtue, okay? But in fact, it might be a destructive part of our being and of our relationship. It might be keeping us separate from, even though we think this is something important to acquire. So like all things, this can be manipulated, but for Francis, the virtues understood properly and the person understood properly, it's about fostering openness and union with others. So this is, I suppose, what he's saying is that these are things that we as individuals can look at ourselves, rather than thinking about the global whole, rather than thinking about society or government or globalization or these enormous realities that are far beyond us. He says we start with ourselves and we examine who we are, to what extent we can better foster this sacred duty of hospitality, as he puts it. But important and all as that is, we have to move beyond ourselves as individuals and we have to examine the social. And that social dimension is also captured in the parable of the Good Samaritan, as we saw. So again, Francis kind of brings this out as we go through this third chapter of Fratelli Tutti. He calls for, in paragraphs 97 and following, he calls for societies that are more open and that integrate everyone. And again, we might ask of ourselves what this would look like in our own communities or in our own society as we try to integrate others, whoever the other might be. It might not necessarily be the migrant or the refugee or whoever. Who is the stranger among us, and how do we better integrate people into our society? It may be people with disability, it may be the traveler community, whoever. But this is what he's calling for, societies that are more open and that integrate people to a far greater extent. But this isn't easy, and there's a tension, if you like, that's very real, that we all, I'm sure, can see and perhaps have experienced, a tension between the individual and the social. So how do you try to balance that, those conflicting priorities, those conflicting realities? Francis, again, in this chapter, says that we don't want to lose a sense of ourselves, of who we are, that a sense of what is unique to us. And this is something that comes up a lot in relation to, public discourse and public rhetoric around, taking in refugees or migrants or societies becoming more pluralist. And we've heard probably this type of language in our own communities and so on, where people are saying, well, we're taking in all of these people, or society's becoming more pluralist, and therefore, we lose a sense of who we are. So our Irishness, just to take that example, is being diluted, or, this kind of thing. And it is part of a stronger, more xenophobic rhetoric as well that you see in the more far right movements and so on. Keep France for the French, keep Irish for the Irish, and so on. And you preserve, therefore, what is peculiar and unique to yourself. You preserve your own identity, and it's not being threatened by some sort of influx of the stranger. And you can understand those sentiments, and they are very real in people. And Francis is extremely aware of this. And he says in paragraph 100, he says, I'm not proposing an authoritarian and an abstract universalism for the sake of leveling and plundering, he says. So we're not suggesting that we all become the same, everything's monochrome, that globalization and universalism means that we all do the same thing, we all wear the same clothes, we all speak the same language, and so on. Francis says that this false universalism ends up depriving the world of its various colors, its beauty, and ultimately its humanity. So we've to try to figure out some way of balancing the unique, what is special, what is specific to us, with the broader claims and with pluralism and with diversity. And Francis goes on to say that the future, he says, is not monochrome. He says, if we are courageous, we can contemplate it in all its variety and diversity of what each individual person can offer. So it's about trying to get the individual and the unique and the peculiar to somehow stay in a healthy tension and in a healthy balance with the social, with the more global, with the bigger picture kind of thing. And when I was reading this section of the third chapter, it reminded me of a philosopher. He's Ghanaian originally, but he's working in America, called Kwame Anthony Appiah. And you don't need to really know too much about him, but he, in his philosophy and in his books, has coined a really interesting phrase. He speaks about rooted cosmopolitanism. So Appiah writes a lot in the area of identity ethics, and he too is trying to sort of figure out how do we bring these two realities together, the individual and the collective. So he talks about rooted cosmopolitanism. He says that we are rooted. We're rooted to a time and to a context and to a narrative and to a song and to a dance. You know, what makes us Irish is different to what makes the French French, and so on and so forth, right? So we're rooted, and we should appreciate that and understand it and celebrate it and be proud of it. But he said we're also cosmopolitan. We belong to the cosmos. We belong to the global or the universal. And that brings its benefits as well as its challenges, and it brings its responsibilities. So we shouldn't be afraid of going out into the cosmos, bringing with us our identities and our talents, but being able to contribute to this bigger kind of global reality, if you like. And in a way, Jonathan Sacks touches on that dynamic or that reality in his TED Talk, where he talked about identity and the importance of narrative and of storytelling, and that those with a strong sense of identity are less threatened by pluralism or by the global or by the stranger coming into your land, and so on and so forth. So it's, as I said, it's a challenge and it's a reality that Francis is very conscious of here in this document, and he explores it more in the next couple of chapters, and we'll be encountering those ideas again as we move into chapters 4 and 5 and so on. And then he goes on in paragraph 102 to again bring back the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he asks the question, what would the reaction to this same story be nowadays, he says, in a world that constantly witnesses the emergence and growth of social groups clinging to an identity that separates them from others? So this issue, if you like, of identity ethics, of how we understand our identity, of the role that identity plays in our lives, is to the forefront of what Francis is saying here, and of this kind of social vision that he's trying to bring out in chapter 3. He then goes on a little bit later into the chapter to speak of the moral good, and he has a section called Promoting the Moral Good. And again, it's very much on the societal level that he's talking here also. And for Francis, part of promoting the moral good is promoting what he describes as integral human development. Now, this is a phrase that is common in Catholic social doctrine from Pope Paul VI onwards. In 1967, Paul VI issued a social encyclical called Populorum Progressio on the development of peoples. And he was writing it as globalization is really kicking off after the Second World War, decolonization is underway, and so on and so forth. And he wants to examine what development actually means. And so much emphasis was placed on the economic development of countries at this time, particularly poorer countries and countries coming out of empires. And Paul is saying, look, we need a broader, more holistic, more complete understanding of development in all its dimensions. So he coins this idea of integral human development, and this is something that's then carried on in later documents. And we find it here also in Fratelli Tutti. And integral human development for Paul, and again echoed here, is about the good of the whole person and of all peoples. And the way Paul described it in Populorum Progressio was very deliberate. It's the good of the whole person. So not just our material needs, not just access to income or access to housing or access to education, important and all as that is. It's about understanding the person in their totality. So Christian anthropology very much coming in here, understanding the person as relational, as spiritual, understanding our relationship with God, the transcendent dimension of our lives, the importance of culture, and all of these other things that contribute to us living fulfilled and happy lives. And how do we try to promote all of those human needs under the umbrella of development? But equally, how do we promote the development of all peoples? So that development isn't just about those, that 1% at the top of the pyramid. It's about all peoples being able to live fulfilled lives according to their hopes and dreams and talents and so on. So Francis, again, very much following on from his predecessors in bringing this notion of integral human development into this third chapter. And for Francis, social solidarity is a key to this. It's kind of the glue that keeps us together, that keeps us working towards a common goal and a common vision, and so on. And there's a very striking section here, it's paragraph 116, where Francis kind of describing what this integral human development is. He says, this means thinking and acting in terms of community. So again, not just kind of an extreme individualistic rights-based idea. He says, thinking and acting in terms of community. It means that the lives of all are prior to the appropriation of goods by a few. Now it's kind of a real slap in the face, if you like, to your sort of unlimited capitalist ideology. You know, Francis is saying it's not about the appropriation of goods by a few, it's about thinking in terms of community, putting people before things. He says it also means combating the structural causes of poverty, inequality, the lack of work, land and housing, and the denial of social and labor rights. So this is all part of the bigger question of integral human development. And then finally, he goes on to talk about, in paragraphs 121 and following, the question of rights without borders, as he puts it, the rights of all peoples, particularly migrants, but not just. And he calls us to think differently. He says in that paragraph 121, he says this presupposes a different way of understanding relations and exchanges between countries. It calls, he says, for an alternative way of thinking. And it calls for, he says, an ethic of international relations. If we're serious about the kind of things he's been talking about, the kind of social vision he's presenting here in this third chapter, we need a new way of relating internationally, globally, as well as individually. And he concludes, or towards the end of that chapter, the conclusion is that if we want this to happen, we have to think differently, we have to see differently, we have to imagine or reimagine. And really what he's coming down to here is what in moral theology we talk about moral imagination. Without moral imagination, we don't get anywhere, right? If we cannot imagine, if we cannot think differently, the world never changes. Everything stays the same. So we are called to be people of moral imagination. Francis is here in this third chapter, in the kind of outline he's presenting here. He's calling us to be imaginative people. He's calling us to be dreamers, if you like, to be idealistic and not to be afraid to be idealistic. And with that in mind, I'm just going to conclude with this very short video, if it'll work for me, which I think captures very well what I mean or what I think of when I think of moral imagination. The great sea changes that have happened up to now in the history of humanity have only happened because people were able to think differently. They were able to imagine a different world. And unless we can make that leap of imagination, we can't then proceed to try to implement this new or better or different world. Okay, so hopefully this will play for me, and I'll end at that, and then we can have some questions and answers. You may need to adjust the volume on your own screen when this starts to play, just that you can hear it fully. So fingers crossed. And here we go, hopefully.
If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. No man is good enough to govern another man without the other's consent.
We have to free half of the human race, the women, so that they can help to free the other half.
Non-violence is the greatest force at the disposal of mankind. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win.
How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world.
In the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness. A time when we have to shed our fear and give hope to each other. That time is now.
I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war, that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word.
As long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. Like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the actions of human beings. Sometimes it falls upon a generation to be great. You can be that great generation